Welcome to a Rice University digital media production. For more information about us, please visit our website at www.rice.edu.
I'm Leonard Lane. I'm on the board of the Friends of Fondren Library, and it's my honor and pleasure to host this event tonight. And we welcome all of you. We apologize for the heat and the fact the elevator is broken, but if any of you are interested in endowing a new elevator, I'm sure the development office will be getting in touch with you.
I showed up anyway. So.
Yeah. Before we begin, I thought I'd take the opportunity while you're here, a captive audience, to tell you about upcoming programs that will be in cooler places. February 9th of 2013, which will be here before we know it, is the annual Friends of Fondren Library Gala. This year will be on Saturday, February 9th at the River Oaks Country Club. And hope to see you all there. Following that, April 10th is the spring edition of Books That Shaped My World. We're very honored to have Bob Pettin is going to be speaking about Charles Dickens. And probably most of you know, of course, that Bob Pettin actually worked with Charles Dickens back as an undergraduate. And this is Chuck Dickens, by the way, not the one you're thinking of. But anyway, he's going to be speaking about Dickens, and I'm sure it will be wonderful. And then, oh my goodness, got it out of order. March the 7th is our annual reception to honor Rice authors, artists, composers, and editors. That will be held over at the RMC, and that's always a great event to hear from people at Rice about the work they've been doing in the past year and speak about their work and actually read from it. So several things to look forward to. All right, I'm sure most of you, as I say, already know Dr. Sass. Ron has asked me to read his entire resume, though, just to make sure. That will take the first half hour of the program. I want to get this right. He's the Harry C. and Olga Keith Weiss Professor of Natural Sciences at Rice. He's also a professor and chair of ecology and evolutionary biology, I guess as opposed to creationism, at Rice. And professor of biology, chemistry, and education, co-director of the Rice Center for Education. For all of those who didn't know that Rice was involved in education, he's here to talk about it. He's been at Rice, I got up my slide rule and calculated that he'd been at Rice 54 years this fall.
About right.
Yeah, and he came here in 1958 as a professor. He had gotten his PhD at the University of Southern California and came here for the climate, I assume.
I did, actually. I was recruited in January.
Oh, okay. There you go. He got his undergraduate education at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois, where he's from that area, and he was telling me that he had gotten his start in chemistry working at the Army Arsenal, the Rock Island Arsenal, where he personally developed a form of grease that was used by the Army to pack machine gun parts, and it was able to work both at sub-zero conditions and at well over 100 degrees. So that was his early claim to fame. And I found out later that when he did come to Rice, it turns out it was also very useful in the central kitchen to preserve hockey pucks, the mystery meat they would serve. So he's had quite a career. And
mystery meat. Huh?
I won't bore you anymore, obviously. I was curious, how many of you were students of Dr. Sass at Rice? Okay, there will be a test later.
Amazing.
All right. Anyway, without further ado, Dr. Ron Sass.
So I've got 20 minutes. Yes, I did. Can you hear me all right? Have any of you had Joe Davies as an instructor? You have, and I know that. Well, the reason I ask is the front row is empty here. And Joe Davies used to talk like this and it spit a little bit. So the front row kind of was a hazardous position. And so I'm not quite that way, but I do remember in Chem 120 that the front row was generally empty also. So if anybody, and I used to invite people to come up and sit a little closer, but nobody ever did. So I wouldn't move if I were you. Now, I'm to talk tonight, I understand, on a book that is life-changing or changed my life or something. And I mentioned to the people I walked over here with tonight that I figure that the last book I read is a book that changed my life all the time. Every time I read another book, I have a different idea what my life ought to be like. And if I really asked myself, what was a seminal book as far as changing my life was concerned, I can't find one. But the one which comes closest, I think, was one that I read a long time ago when I first came to Rice University and was confronted with all of the challenges that I had here. It was Situational Ethics by Harvey Cox. And I will not talk about that tonight because although it was life-changing in some ways that I really don't particularly care to talk about. So anyway, I brought my Kindle along, and I read some books on the Kindle. And some that I might have talked about, I go down the list here. Younger Next Year, which is a book on physical fitness, which allows you to live to 80 in good shape. Well, I'm 80, so I figure I can stop doing physical exercise and I can stop reading books like that. And then Ken Follett's book, Winter of the World, which is book 2 of the series, and Fall of Giants, which is book 1. I would recommend those to anybody who hasn't read them. It's a good history from the point of view of Russia, Great Britain, Germany, and the United States, of both First and Second World Wars and what happened in between them. And as far as I can tell, the guy did an awful lot of research on it. But he went into the lives of fictional people and presented history that way. And the book I want to talk about tonight does the same thing. But the one before that was The Moral Landscape, and then a thing called Dark Places, which was written by Gillian Flynn. And Cloud Atlas. Has anybody read Cloud Atlas? Did you like it? It's a pretty weird book to read. It travels through history, and it takes you through several reincarnations of what you think are reincarnations of this person's life. And they're making a movie. They've made a movie out of it now, and I think it is showing. Well, don't go to see the movie unless you read the book, because it'll be an absolute mystery to you what's going on. It's an absolute mystery to read the book, actually, because he goes through time from the past to the future and then backs off again and comes back to the same way. And then you learn finally near the end what's going on. But very interesting book. But the one I want to talk about tonight is called The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Through a Window and Disappeared. Interesting title in itself. Anybody read that book? Anybody heard about that book? It's a book that has sold already 3.5 million copies. It's been translated into 35 languages. It got translated into English and came to the United States in July of this year. So it has a good history. It was on the best-selling list in Romania, Finland, Germany, Norway, Sweden, France, Italy, and a few other places. So it may sound like it's a ridiculous book, which it is, but it's a very interesting read, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I recommend it to you. Now, what's it all about? Okay, as I told you, it's sold already 3.5 million copies. It was the most sold book in Sweden in 2010, which is where it was written, by a man named Jonas Jonasson, or Jonas Jonasson, if you like. And it was the bestseller award in Sweden for the same year. It published, as I said, here in July of this year. Now, the book is really 2 stories, and it starts, very interestingly, in an old folks' home, where Nurse Alice is the dictator, and our protagonist here, Alan Carlson, is 100 years old, and he's celebrating his 100th birthday on May 2nd, 2005. I was born in May, not in 2005, but shortly thereafter. So I kind of thought, well, there's a commonality there. There's something that projects me into the book somehow. So I have a way of projecting myself into the book, and that's kind of the way I want to attack this tonight. So I said it's two stories in one. One goes from that day forward, and the other one goes way back and brings you up to that date. So you see what he's like after he's 100 years old, and you see what he was like before he became 100 years old. No, I'm not going to take you through the whole book. I would rather you read it yourself. But what I would like to do is give you a little taste for it. So after a long and eventful life, Alan Carlson, Swedish, ends up in an old nursing home, along with director Alice, with no vodka and waiting for the end of his life. But he's still in rather good health, and then one day, May 2nd, 2005, he turns 100. A big celebration is planned with the mayor, the press, and his fellow inmates in attendance. But Alan isn't really interested, and he'd like a bit more control over his vodka consumption, which he has been disallowed in the old folks' home. He sneaks out and gets it anyway, but that's another story. So he impulsively decides to escape. He climbs out the window in his slippers and embarks on an entirely unplanned but ridiculous funny journey involving a suitcase stuffed with millions of dollars, actually millions of kroner, but unpleasant criminals from whom he stole the suitcase, and adventuresome friends with a 69-year-old habitual but friendly criminal hermit, a helpful hot dog stand operator, and his brother, who is a gangster, a red-headed woman and her dog and elephant, and the chief of police, who has been trying to find and arrest him for 3 murders, which he did commit, actually. But the 3 people who he murdered were people who were also gangsters and were after him because the way he got his millions of dollars worth of cash was to steal it off of them. And so I start there, and I will just read you a couple of pages out of the beginning of the book, and you get a little flavor of the way the author deals with things. Alan Carlson hesitated as he stood there in the flower bed. He came out the window and fell immediately into the petunias that ran along one side of the old folks' home. He was wearing a brown jacket and brown trousers, and on his feet he had a pair of brown indoor slippers. Why brown is associated with old age, I don't know, but I don't wear brown anymore in my life. He was not a fashion plate. People rarely are at that age. He was on the run from his own birthday party, another unusual thing for a 100-year-old, not least because even being 100 is pretty rare. Alan thought about whether he should make an effort to crawl back in through the window to get his hat and shoes, but when he felt his wallet on his inside pocket, he decided that it would suffice by itself. Besides, Director Alice had repeatedly shown that she had a 6th sense, like wherever he had hid his vodka, she found it. And she might be nosing around in there even now, suspicious that something fishy was going on. Better to be on his way while he could, Alan thought, as he stepped out of the flower bed on creaking knees. In his wallet, as far as he could remember, he had a few notes saved. It turns out there were 50 kroner in there. And so when he gets to where he's going, to the bus station, he asks the man behind the counter there, how far can I get on 50 kroner? Because that's all the money he had, so that's as far away as he could get from the bus station. Now, when he got wherever he's going to be absolutely broke. So things have to happen. So while he's in the bus station, I'm getting ahead of my story, but while he was in the bus station, a man is there with a large suitcase, and this man has to go to the bathroom. And the bathroom is so small, because it's a very small town that he lives in, that the bathroom can't accommodate both the man and the suitcase. So he asks Alan, who looks like a very reasonable man at 100 years of age, would he watch his suitcase while he's in the bathroom? Well, while he's in the bathroom and Alan's watching his suitcase, his bus comes. So he picks up the suitcase and gets on the bus. And when he's on the bus, oh my gosh, he says, this is not my suitcase. But maybe it's got a pair of shoes in it. So he keeps it, and on he goes. Well, anyway, going back, He turned to take one last look at the old folks' home that until a few moments ago he had thought would be his last residence on earth. And then he told himself that he could die some other time in some other place. The 100-year-old man set off in his pea slippers, P-E-E, so called because men of an advanced age rarely pee farther than their stooge. First through a park, I won't verify that one way or another. First through a park and then alongside an open field where a market was occasionally held in an otherwise quiet provincial town. In a few hundred yards, Alan went around the back of the district's medieval church and sat down on a bench next to some gravestones to rest his aching knees. The piety of the area was not such that Alan worried about being disturbed. He noted an ironic coincidence, however. He was born in the same year as Henning Algertsen, who lay beneath a stone just across from the bench. But there was an important difference. Henning had given up the ghost 61 years earlier. If Alan had been more curious, he might have wondered what Henning died of at the age of 39, but Alan did not get into other people's business, if he could avoid it, which he usually did. Instead, he thought that he had probably been mistaken when he'd sat in the old folks' home, feeling as if he might as well be dead. However, many aches and pains he suffered, it had to be much more interesting and instructive to be on the run from Director Alice than to be lying rigid 6 feet under. Which upon thought, the birthday boy, despite his complaining knees, got up and said goodbye to Henning and continued on his badly planned flight. Alan cut across the churchyard to the south until a stone wall appeared in his path. It wasn't more than 3 feet high, but Alan was a centenarian, not a high jumper. On the other side was the bus station, and the old man suddenly realized that his rickety legs were taking him towards that building that could be very useful to him, which I've already talked to you about. Once, many years earlier, Alan had crossed the Himalayas. That was no picnic. Alan thought about the experience now as he stood before the last hurdle between himself and the bus station. He considered the matter so intently that the stone wall in front of his eyes seemed to shrink. And when it was at its very lowest, Alan crept over it, aged knees be damned. And so the story continues. Every other chapter in the book, one goes back, one goes forward, to a touching and rather happy ending. So there's this interleaf between historical events and what's going on in Alan's future. I would suggest that what goes on, hello, geez, what goes on in his future is very much, and his past also, very much like Chauncey Gardiner in Being There. Have any of you seen the movie Being There with Chauncey Gardiner? Well, Chauncey is Chauncey the Gardener, and he's a rather simple person, unassuming, takes his gardening very seriously, and he gets around to rich people because he's a gardener for them. And some of them are politicians, and some begin to talk about things to Chauncey because they've already now mistaken him for being Chauncey Gardiner, not Chauncey the Gardener. And so they ask him about things. What's going to happen with the stock market, for example? Will it grow? Well, Chauncey hears the word grow, and he says, oh, things grow in the garden. And they grow in the spring. Oh, they grow in the spring. So that means that the stock market is going to grow. Well, you got the story. Well, that's the way our man here operates. He gets involved in various things. And he meets interesting people throughout his life. The Tsar of Russia, Nicholas, for example. And he befriends Nicholas and advises them on Tsarism. Gustav Fabergé, the great Russian silversmith. And Alan was an explosive expert. So he didn't know much about silversmithing, but he did know about mining. And so he was able to tell Fabergé certain things. Then he meets Vladimir Lenin, Miguel Primo de Rivera, the Spanish general and dictator of Spain, Francisco Franco, Generalissimo Francisco Franco, who we almost blew up one time because he was blowing up bridges, and Franco was marching across the bridge with the soldiers. And he runs out and he tells, don't cross the bridge, don't cross the bridge. And as he does not cross the bridge blows up. Well, Franco thinks he's his hero, takes him in, and so on. Complete fabrication. But the history is pretty good, except for Alan. And it's a very interesting way of learning some history. I was watching a thing on YouTube of some young lady who was trying to review the book, and she says, wonderful book, great adventure. She said, but I wish they'd leave out the history because I don't know any of that history. So, Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. Now, Alan was a janitor at Los Alamos, and he meets Oppenheimer there, and he brings coffee to the physicists. And he's sweeping around, and he's bringing coffee, and he overhears what they're saying and so forth. And they're worrying how they're going to bring together this critical mass of uranium in order to make the bomb explode. And Alan has an idea, because he's an explosive expert. So he tells them, you build this thing out here with the uranium out here, and you put explosive charges behind it, and you wham it all together, and you get a critical mass. And go, well, it worked. So Alan becomes an atomic physicist. And the Russians hear about this, and that's how he meets Stalin. And he tells Stalin how to do the same thing, and he regretted it ever since. He also met Harry Truman during that time because Oppenheimer introduced him to Harry as one of the heroes of the atomic war. And on and on and on. Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, Kim Il-sung, leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and his son, who he took over his knee and spanked at the time, Mao Zedong, Charles de Gaulle, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. And the list goes on. And there's I think, 35 chapters in this book. So, you know, every other one of them is some historical event. And so there has to be at least 16 or 17 historical events that he talks about. Each one of them has a different person in it. He runs out of people, and he during his excursions with the atomic bomb, wanted to meet Albert Einstein. And also the Russians wanted to kidnap Albert Einstein. And he got involved in that. But they mistaken Albert's brother, Herbert, for Albert. And Herbert turns out to be fairly moronic. And just about the same as Alan. They're very good friends. And that's another story in there that's hilarious. But of course, Albert Einstein did not have a half-brother called Herbert. But that didn't seem to bother the author either. And then he meets a waitress in Thailand who we'll see again later in the book when she becomes his wife when she is 85 and he is 101. So these adventures take him to Sweden, Moscow, Stalingrad, the Gulag camps. He was imprisoned because it turned out that they did not like the way he told them in Russia to make the bomb. Los Alamos, the White House in Washington, China, the Himalayas, Tibet, Afghanistan, Iran, North Korea, Bali, and Paris. So you get a travel log as you go along. So it's a fragmented but interestingly complicated and completely fabricated life up to the time that he enters the old folks' home. Now the reason why I chose this book to review is in part the author's story. And the author is Jonas Jonasson, who right now is 51 years old, not 100. He's the youngest of 3 brothers from southern Sweden. His mother was a nurse and his father was an ambulance driver. You can imagine how they met. Graduating from Gothenburg University, where he studied Swedish and Spanish, he started working for Expressen, Sweden's largest newspaper. He joined the staff when he completed his studies. He was, by all accounts, on his way to the top in journalism, truly. This is not made up now like his story is. This is his life. And then he quit. And he went to work as a media consultant a year later with Sweden's commercial channel TV4 as a producer. So you can see that he was well thought of in his profession. Within a few years, he owned his own media company with more than 100 employees. He worked 7 days a week and at least 16 hours a day for 2 decades. By the end of 2003, he had had 2 major back operations and was generally feeling dreadful. One day, his heart started racing, and he thought he was having a heart attack. He went to the doctor, and his doctor said, "You don't have a heart attack. You're just killing yourself through stress." Well, now, in 2003, I had a heart attack. No, I had heart failure, actually. And Sid, you remember when I got out to speak to Ciencia after that and practically fell over. But I was ready to die at that point. And Ellen's author here was ready to die at the same time. So I kind of looked at that as kind of companion experiences. But he didn't die. He stopped working. He went on antidepressants and had therapy. But for months, he was so anxious and exhausted, he could barely walk to the kitchen. I spent a year in bed after mine, so I sort of looked at that as a companion experience. Now, what this is telling me is that if the author, through all of these experiences, which I have very similar ones to, started writing a book like this, maybe that's what I ought to do. Now, I'll get to that later. In 2005, at age 44, he sold his company. Not enough. But he sold it for 10 million pounds, which was not a bad thing, and moved to a remote part of Sweden on the south coast with his cat, Molotov. Now, I retired from Rice in 2005. Now, I didn't have $10 million at the time, let alone 10 million pounds. But I had sufficient to retire, and I lived fairly well on that. And so, again, we have kind of a... I did not move to an island. I did not move to Sweden. But that's a later story, too. Well, he got lonely on his island, so he went on a dating game called Match.com and made contact with a 40-year-old mixed-race Norwegian woman. In his own words, "It was all too quick. I was desperate to be loved. She said she loved me, and I wanted to believe her. She became pregnant a few months later after we met, and we married in February of 2007. By the time his son was born, the marriage was in trouble. They decided to move to an apartment overlooking Lake Lugano. Have you ever been to Lake Lugano? God-awful beautiful spot. If you're going to move somewhere in the world and you got 10 million pounds, go there, Locarno, Lugano, Como, all those nice lakes in northern Italy. Look, and get yourself a place in Switzerland, looking down on them, the mountains. It's absolutely wonderful. So I kind of touched with him there, too, because I spent a summer in that spot, and it was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. The way I got there was not because I had a lot of money, but because I was on sabbatical leave, and the guy who had this place in Switzerland was coming to Rice for a sabbatical leave, and we switched houses. I got the better part of the deal there. Not only did I get this nice house overlooking this beautiful lake district high in the mountains, but his father was a brewer. And so I had all the beer I wanted, and he also liked wine. I had all the wine I wanted, and a lovely, lovely time. By the time his son was born, the marriage was in trouble. They decided to move to an apartment, as I said, a fresh start. It didn't help. They divorced in 2009 through the Swiss courts, and an unusual decision was made that he should have sole custody of his child, no access to the wife. Now, my wife of 40 years was diagnosed with cancer in 2007, and she died in 2009. We were in love, and we had a nice marriage, not like his, but at least the dates coincide. So again, we have this kind of strange juxtaposition. He began writing seriously while he was in Switzerland. People would ask me what I did for a living, and I didn't know what to say. I felt I had no identity, so thought the time was at last right to become an author. That's kind of strange. I have no identity, so I'll become an author. It would seem to me that you have to have an identity to be an author. Maybe not. Maybe you assume the identity of the person or persons you're writing about. And I have a feeling that's what he was doing in this book. He was fantasizing his own life through Ellen, his creation. Writing also helped me escape from my traumas, he said. When it was finished, I posted it to 6 Swedish publishers. 5 turned it down, and the 6th rang, sounded very excited, and said, I have read half your book. We want to publish it. I replied, do you want to publish half or do you want to read it all? The book was published in Sweden in 2011. Now, I kind of regained my life in 2011, too. I had, by this time now, been thoroughly marginalized by Rice University in my own mind. Whenever you retire from a place, I think it's inevitable that you will be immediately marginalized in your own mind. I'm looking at some people back there who are also retired. But it's true. You work very hard as a professor. You do your teaching, you do your research, you do whatever service you're going to do. You spend hours and hours a day, every day of the week doing this, and all of a sudden it's gone. Marginalized. And I have yet to write a book, but what I did do was start working with lawyers and learn how to write legally. I would work with Jim Blackburn. Anybody know Jim Blackburn? Blackburn is probably the best environmental lawyer in Texas, in my mind. His paralegal took a course that I was giving in the Continuing Studies program, Master of Liberal Studies program. Anybody not familiar with Master of Liberal Studies? I could put a little jog in on that if you like. It's a beautiful program. It's 11 courses long. It takes you about 3 or 4 years. You take one at a time, maybe 2 at a time. 3 is trimester instead of semester. And you graduate with a master's degree from Rice University. And you will have been taught by wonderful people like myself, but more wonderful Dennis Houston, who stands up on the desk in there and teaches Shakespeare just like he does to the Rice undergraduates. Well, anyway, I'm teaching this course, and there's a woman in there who is a paralegal for Jim Blackburn. And I didn't know Jim very well. I knew him by sight. I knew him by name. I was able to talk, say hello to him, and so forth. But one day, he asked her how the course was going. And this was her first course in the program. And she looked at him, and she says, it's going wonderfully. She says, it's taught by Ronald Sass, and he's smarter than you are, Jim. Well, a hell of a thing for a paralegal to say to her boss. But he called me up, and he invited me to lunch. And he quizzed me. And about a week later, he called me again, and he says, I have a job for you. So I said, well, okay, let's talk about it. So we established a salary range by hour. And it wasn't 10 million pounds again, but it was nice. And what it was he had the King Ranch was his employer. He was working for them. They were his client. And they did not want the Kennedy Ranch to build a wind farm. I don't know if you know about that area, but here's the Kennedy Ranch and here's the King Ranch. It's in 4 quadrants up here. And so if you put a wind farm in the middle there, you're interacting with all 4 of these areas of the King Ranch. And the King Ranch prides itself on the bird population that it has, not only for bird watching, but for bird shooting and so on. And there's other hunting that goes on here. And they figure, rightly so, that something might happen to their bird population if you put a windmill in there. Well, I'm a climate scientist by trade, and I'm supposed to be 100% for wind power. So I said to Jim, Jim, you're on the wrong side of the bench on this. Or at least you shouldn't ask me to help you because I'm for wind power. He says, take a look at it. Take a look at it. Well, I did, and he said, if you find that I am really, truly on the wrong side here, I'll give up the case. Well, now, I don't know ethically, this is where situational ethics come in, old Harvey Cox. I don't know ethically whether or not you start working on something to find something that you don't find it, no matter what it is. So I found 2 reasons why we shouldn't put the wind farm there, both of which I think were rather valid, but I'm not quite sure. Obviously, you're going to hurt the bird population because that's on the migratory route. So then the company comes back and says, well, we're going to put a radar station there, and we will shut the windmills down when the birds come by. Okay? So I had to go back to the drawing board and find something else to sue them on because the King Ranch was hiring us to not have a wind farm there. And so I did a complete mass balance on the water intake and outflow and salinity of Laguna Madre, and what impact the wind farm would have on that. And you wouldn't think it would have much of an impact, but it has roads on it, it has ditches on it, it has berms on it, it has dikes on it, it has ground level pipes running through it. And it turns out that it gives you a series of dams. And the only area in the Laguna Madre area where there is enough water runoff normally to keep the salinity down in Laguna Madre. And so I calculated what the increase of salinity would be if you had a wind farm, and it turns out that it would be enough that it would become hypersaline to the point where the fish population would migrate away, and you'd lose a $2 billion a year sports industry. Well, it turns out this was in state court, and the company was rich, and the Kennedy Ranch was really owned by the Catholic Church. And the Pope sent an envoy over to talk to our governor. And we lost the case. But the King Ranch paid us anyway. So that's how I changed my life in 2011. Only it worked up to it from about 2007 or 8. And before Margie had died, I started doing that. So anyway, that again I thought was a relationship between me and the author. So now he has a new partner. He says, I met Marie, a 45-year-old TV journalist who works on a book program at the Swedish Book Fair in Gothenburg. We now live together, and I feel I can trust someone again. And he's planning on getting married again. Well, it turns out I'm planning on getting married again. And we will probably do it about the same time. And at that point, both our stories are now ended because we've come up to the present time. Now, the only last part about it is my intended bride and myself are writing a book. And we're writing a book which started as another couple of lawsuits in South Texas where we were suing uranium miners. And so I am writing a history of uranium mining in Texas. And I'll bet not many of you know that there are uranium mines in Texas, or that you know where they are. So you're going to have to read my book when it gets finished, and I'll tell you all about it. So thank you very much. I enjoyed talking with you. I hope you have some questions. And if you want to ask me about any details in the book, I'll do that, or anything else. Or if you have questions left over from Chem 120, I'll answer those.
If you have questions, we'd like you to use the microphone since we're recording this.
Listed an eclectic, small list of books, and I think all of us have who read a lot or like to read a lot are sort of deluged by book reviews. You can get lost in the New York Times book review, but how do you decide
how do I
what
choose
to read?
my books?
Yeah, how do you decide what to read?
In an eclectic fashion. I read 50 Shades of Grey, for example, which I didn't mention here, but since you asked about it. And the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo trilogy, I read all 3 of those, primarily because everybody else was reading those. I read the Ken Follett books because I read about them in the New York Times book review. I read about the second one, which is just out. And I thought, well, I hadn't read the first one, so I'll go back and read that one first. I'm very glad I did. If the third one's anything like the first 2, the trilogy is a very smooth transition from one book to the next. And if people would buy books with 1,000 pages in them, they could probably all 3 be published together. The other thing is, there were some self-help books in there. I didn't mention some books on climate change because I didn't think that was appropriate to this audience. Who's interested in climate change? I am. There was the book on
no Republicans.
There was the book on how to make yourself better physically. Well, I told you I'm getting married, so that makes kind of sense, doesn't it? Let's see what else. What I feel for at the time, I think. I like murder mysteries sometimes. I like historical novels a lot. And I'll pick up almost any of them. Another way of looking is I get most of my stuff on Kindle, and you can tell how good a book is by how much Amazon charges for it. And so you can hit around $13 or $14 and get a pretty good book. You can go free, and sometimes you get a pretty good book, but not always. I have the complete works of Shakespeare on here, which I got free. And I have the complete works of Dickens, which I got free. I have some philosophers. They come a dime a dozen. But generally, I would say that Amazon does their marketing fairly well. And if you read one of their books that are more expensive, you'll be able to talk about it to everybody else you know because they'll do the same thing. But I think that's the other part of it. I like to read books that I can talk to people about.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Do you ever read a paperback anymore?
Yeah, I was almost going to go out and buy this one in paperback because I wanted to thumb back and forth through it. Now, the Cloud Atlas was that way. I should not have bought it for the Kindle. The Cloud Atlas is a book where you have to go back and forth. And going back and forth on a Kindle is not the easiest thing in the world. So I bought that also in paperback after I had read the thing, and I reread it. Yeah, I agree with you. My fiancée does not like the Kindle because she marks her books up all the time, and you can't mark a Kindle very easily. Well, you can, but again, it's not the easiest thing in the world.
This is a little off topic, do you have a bucket list?
A book bucket list or a bucket list? My own bucket list. That's a good question. During the course of my research in climate change, I went practically every place in the world I wanted to go. I worked in Alaska, I worked in Upper Canada, I worked in almost every country in Asia. I worked in South America. I was involved with the Brazilian government when they moved their rice fields from the northern part of Brazil down to the southern part. So I got to live in both northern and southern Brazil. And if you can't live in Switzerland on the south side of the mountains, go to southern Brazil. It's Rio Grande do Sul. It's a wonderful place. We don't normally... Pardon?
Did you go to Caxambu?
Yes. It's a beautiful, beautiful area. Get out of the big cities. Get into the countryside. My German got me by very well there. What little German I know. I know more German than I know Portuguese. But everybody there speaks Portuguese, German, or Italian. And very nice area. I've been all over Europe. So a bucket list. I guess bucket list for me would not be where to go, but what to do. But I've not owned land, but I have had land given to me to use in China. And I've had my own farmers over there. Had a very interesting experience. I've been to see the panda bears, which very few Chinese are able to do. A bucket list. I'm rather anxious to get married again. But that's always something I've already done, but to a different person. I hate like hell to live alone. I don't like to cook very much, and I do like to eat, however. Now, it turns out that we cook together, and I like that because somebody tells me what to do. And I cook very well when somebody tells me what to do. But I'm kind of afraid of temperature on the stove, you know. Being a chemist, that doesn't make much sense, but I generally end up burning things. And so that's one thing, anyway. And Solette likes to travel, so I'll probably be traveling again. But not to the back country of Asia, because that's probably not where she wants to travel. Probably Paris will come on my bucket list, and maybe Montreal and a few places like that.
Hi, I love your little talk book, and thanks for sharing everything with us. I just wondered, do you have a list of books you'd recommend for us not to read?
Oh boy. I don't think there is a book that you should not read, because even bad books give you some experience. I'll tell you, the 50 Shades of Grey did not turn me on. Truthfully speaking. It had some stuff in it that I guess I wasn't aware of.
You didn't finish the trilogy?
And I did not finish the trilogy. I did not go past book 1. I had learned enough. Now, after all, I'm 80 years old, for crying out loud. And age has its limitations. And I'm not a sadist, and I'm not a masochist. I don't believe in beating people up. I don't believe in making life unpleasant for somebody for my own pleasure. It just doesn't work that way for me. So there's one I wouldn't read again, or I probably should not. Well, I'm happy though that I read it once, because now I can at least denigrate it when people ask me about it. But I did read, as I mentioned, I think, the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I read all 3 of those, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. That is a woman I could fall in love with. Now I haven't, I hastily add, but she's all right. I love alpha women in the first place, and she was certainly an alpha plus.
Well, I think this is a first for our Books That Shaped My World presentations. Anybody else?
I wanted to ask you an off-topic question, but after the storm just occurred that inundated the whole.
You're going to ask me whether climate change had anything to do with it?
Now I'm asking you, how that event, affected your generalized view of the effects of rising sea level in the world.
Well, it was a juxtaposition of 3 different weather patterns, and that was very unusual. On the other hand, the sea level has risen and will continue to rise. The temperature of the world has changed perceptibly and been very well shown now. No models, complete look at observed data. And I have a whole lot. What happened to me because of that is I have a whole new lecture on probability theory and temperature, which is very compelling in my mind, and very new data. So the question you should have asked, which is the one I can't answer, did climate change have anything to do with this? And the answer is, depends on how you look at it. Because climate change has changed the probabilistic temperature range. The storm we just saw, Sandy, was probably a 1 in 1,000 event if I would take the statistics from 1950 to 60. But it's probably one in maybe 150 event now. And so we're going to have increased intensity of storms, because the higher the temperature of the water, the more vapor pressure of the water, the more water you put in the atmosphere. The more water you put in the atmosphere, the more it can condense, the more energy you're going to get out of the heat of condensation, and the stronger the storms are going to be. That's a fact. Now, did climate change have anything to do with that? Yeah, it caused the temperature to rise. But I would hastenly add that doesn't necessarily mean that the various conditions that were responsible for the generation of that storm were due to climate change. They're there all the time. So your frequency is going to change, your intensity is going to change. You're going to upset what we would call business as usual statistics. Munich Re, the reinsuring company from Switzerland, is very much interested in that. And they are the big proponents of climate change research and climate change studies, particularly statistical, because they're going to lose a lot of money if they're not careful. And they're very careful. So we'll see what happens.
Yes.
So I may not have heard all of them, or I can't recall all of them, but it seems like the books that you ran through, it seems like almost all those were fiction. So do you lean towards one genre or another? Do you not read as much nonfiction, or?
Oh, I oscillate back and forth. I think you need fiction every now and then.
I kind of go through periods where
Yeah.
I lean one way or the other.
When I graduated from my PhD and went to work at Brookhaven Laboratories on Long Island, I had a kind of a summer hiatus in there where my job didn't take too much time and I had already finished my degree. I read 38 junk novels and enjoyed every minute of it, and then stopped. And went back to science again. So, you know, whatever turns you on at the moment, I think, is what you ought to do. Follow your bliss, as it said. Ann?
With that, I suggest...
Wait, we got one more here.
Oh, we have one more?
Dr. Goldstein.
Do you remember a book called Clan of the Caveman?
Yes, I do remember. Jane Auel.
I'm curious to know if you read the rest of them.
Yes, I did.
Okay, the reason I asked is because
That was the best one of the
I
bunch.
was intrigued by the title of your talk, because you're recommending that book to me was a very good move, because being a woman in science on the leading edge in the 70s, you know, I could really identify with that character, and I think you knew I would, which is why you told me to read that book. You probably don't remember that, but it really made me understand what it's like to live in another culture, and I had not done that.
Well, she had done an awful lot of work, background for that book. Ann and I worked together a while back, so, before climate change.
Well, we do have a reception out here in the cooler part of the building, and I'm sure Dr. Sass will.
This program is protected by copyright and may not be redistributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of Rice University Digital Media Services.